The darkness before dawn on the Western Front was a unique kind, clinging, thick, saturated with the smell of cold mud, gunpowder, and an inextinguishable, animalistic fear. It seeped under the collar of his coarse cloth uniform, absorbed into his skin, and it seemed as though the very air was made of a myriad of icy needles. Hans froze in his foxhole, listening to a silence more terrifying than the roar of artillery. Silence meant the enemy was near, crawling across the same frozen earth, his breath also catching in a white puff of vapor. He was only 19, but his face, covered in 3-day-old stubble and grime, looked like the mask of an old man. Spinning in his head like a broken record were not his mother's words from her last letter, nor memories of a warm home in Bavaria, but the dry, sharp phrases from the weekly Die Deutsche Wochenschau newsreel they were shown behind the lines. The narrator's powerful, almost divine voice, booming from the loudspeakers, created a perfect image under the spotlights of national faith. There, on the dazzling white screen, shone the invincible steel armada of the Reich. Flawless columns of soldiers marched, their faces glowing with unshakable conviction in the righteousness of their cause. There, the war was great, clean, and just. Here, in a trench flooded with meltwater, the war was different. It was the lice in the seams of his underwear, the rust on his rifle, the eternal hunger, and a sorrow that made his jaw ache. But even this reality could not shake what had been hammered into his mind by months, years of total, all-pervasive propaganda. Its greatest weapon was not the image of the hero, but the image of the enemy. In the East, as they were told, they fought Judeo-Bolshevik subhumans, savage hordes led by commissars who knew neither honor nor mercy. Stories of what was done to prisoners on the Eastern Front were passed from one person to the next, growing more gruesome with each retelling. They are castrated, skinned alive, harnessed to plows like horses. These stories felt more real than a commander's orders because they struck at the most vulnerable point, the subconscious terror of a torturous death. But the Western Allies were no knights in shining armor either. Dr. Goebbels's propaganda machine painted them differently, but no less terrifyingly. They were not savages, but decadent, cynical plutocrats. The Americans were naive cowboys, corrupted by jazz and Hollywood films, yet stupefied by Jewish propaganda of revenge. The British were treacherous colonizers, dreaming of seeing Germany in ruins. Capture by them, the posters assured, meant slave labor on plantations, medical experiments, and a slow decline in camps somewhere in the African desert. Victory or Siberia, screamed a poster in the East. In the West, the implication was the same, only instead of Siberia, it was Canada or some other cold, lifeless land. A week ago, Hans had received a package from home. Among the hardtack and woolen socks lay a folded copy of the Völkischer Beobachter newspaper. The front page featured an article about the Morgenthau Plan, a monstrous Allied scheme to turn Germany into one vast potato field and the German people into a nation with no future. He read the lines about the sterilization of German men and the transformation of his homeland into an agrarian appendage, and an icy terror gripped him more tightly than the winter cold. This was not abstract politics. This was about him, about his future, which might not exist, about his children, who would never be born. The belief that capture meant the end of everything became absolute, almost religious. The order, "Do not surrender," did not come from the mouths of officers. It resonated from within, in his very blood. It was the only logical conclusion to be drawn from the worldview that had been painted for them. Death in battle was terrible, but it was quick and honest. It was a hero's end that would be written about in the letter to his family. Capture, on the other hand, was a fall into an abyss of humiliation, torture, and oblivion. It was the path of a coward who betrayed not only the Führer and the Reich, but also his own family, condemning them to shame. None of them, from the private to the general, could believe that war could be any different, that any conventions, any rules of humanity could exist. They themselves had not observed them on foreign soil, so why should anyone observe them in return? Dawn slowly began to stain the sky in shades of gray, and with it came the roar of engines, not German, the enemy's. Hans gripped the cold metal of his Kar 98K tighter. He had only 12 rounds left, 11 for the enemy, and 1 for himself. That last bullet was his only guarantee, his personal insurance policy against the hell he knew for certain awaited him if he surrendered. In his mind, there was no choice between life and death. There was only a choice between two kinds of death, a swift one on the battlefield or a long and torturous one in the hands of the enemy. And he had made his choice. The rumble, which at first seemed like a distant roll of thunder, transformed into a deafening, all-consuming earthquake within 20 minutes. The ground in Hans's foxhole trembled, showering his helmet with clumps of frozen clay. From the morning fog, like prehistoric monsters, the steel silhouettes of Sherman tanks emerged. There were not 2 or 3 of them. It seemed a whole iron ocean was advancing on their flimsy line of defense, and the waves of this ocean were made of fire and steel. It all happened with a nightmarish, surreal speed. Their only MG-42 machine gun choked after a short, furious burst. The anti-tank rifle, their last hope, was crushed by the tracks of the very first tank, turning into a mangled piece of metal along with its crew. The air filled with screams that were immediately drowned out by the roar of explosions. This was not a battle. It was an extermination. A few minutes later, everything fell silent as suddenly as it had begun. Hans, stunned and dazed, came to his senses, pressed against the bottom of his foxhole. A ringing silence surrounded him, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackling of burning wood. He peeked out. Of their platoon, which had numbered 32 men that morning, almost no one was left. 10 meters away lay the sergeant who just yesterday had taught them how to properly throw a grenade. He had kept his word and saved the last bullet for himself. His helmet lay nearby, a neat hole darkening his temple. Hans swallowed convulsively. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle's bolt. 11 for them, 1 for himself. But then he heard voices. Calm, businesslike, speaking in a foreign, barking language. And then someone shouted in broken German, with a terrible accent. Hände hoch! Kommen Sie raus! Hands up! Come out! In that moment, 2 universes collided in his 19-year-old mind. One was the universe of propaganda, where torture and a painful death at the hands of bloodthirsty avengers awaited him. The other was the universe of instinct, which desperately, animalistically, wanted to live, to breathe, to see the sun. A second stretched into an eternity. He looked at his finger resting on the trigger. Then he shifted his gaze to the grimy, terrified faces of 2 youths just like him, crawling out of the next foxhole with their hands up, and his resolve cracked. With a dry, sickening click that seemed louder to him than any explosion, he dropped his rifle into the mud. The Kar 98K, his faithful companion, which he had cleaned every day, was now just a useless piece of wood and metal. He slowly raised his hands, palms out, showing that he was empty-handed and unarmed. The first American soldiers he saw up close did not look like the demons from the posters. They were tired young men in dirty uniforms, their helmets covered with camouflage netting. One of them was chewing gum, looking at the prisoners with complete indifference, like a farmer looking at livestock that had wandered into his yard. No hatred, no fury, just a job. They were searched quickly and methodically. They took his knife, lighter, and soldier's paybook. Hans watched the American's hands with a sinking heart as they rummaged through his pockets, expecting a blow from a rifle butt, or a knife. But the soldier, finding a crumpled pack of cigarettes, just smirked, shook one out for himself, and threw the rest on the ground. And then, something happened that his mind could not comprehend. Nearby lay Klaus from his squad, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his pant leg soaked with blood. He was groaning, his eyes full of animal terror. Hans was sure they would shoot him now, like a wounded horse, to avoid the trouble. But instead, a stocky American with a red cross on his sleeve ran up to Klaus. He knelt, muttering something soothing in English, cut the pant leg, and began to efficiently apply a bandage. Then he took a small syringe of morphine from his bag and injected it into Klaus's thigh. A minute later, the groans stopped. The German soldier looked at the American medic with a childlike, bewildered amazement. This was the first blow to the foundation of his world. The second followed immediately. The 15 or so survivors were herded into a small group. They stood shivering, whether from cold or fear, awaiting their fate. One of the guards, a very young man with a freckled face, looked at their pale, frightened faces, sighed, and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a Hershey's chocolate bar, broke it into several pieces, and with a crooked grin, offered it to the nearest prisoner. The man recoiled as if from a snake. The American then broke off a piece for himself, put it in his mouth, and chewed it demonstratively. Then he offered the rest to the Germans again. Timidly, not believing their eyes, one of the prisoners took a piece, then another. A minute later, they, yesterday's soldiers of the Great Reich, stood chewing American chocolate, the taste of which seemed divine after months of ersatz coffee and stale bread. This was not just a treat, it was an act of absurd, impossible, unthinkable kindness. It was a password from another world, one that was hacking into their reality. Hans held his piece in his hand, feeling it melt, not daring to bring it to his mouth. He looked at the Americans, at their ordinary faces, at the medic covering Klaus with a blanket, and only one deafening thought pounded in his head. They lied. They lied to us about everything. The journey from the front lines to the coast of France was a blurred, feverish dream. Broken and disarmed, they were herded into marching columns, then loaded into trucks that looked like huge green boxes. Hans and his comrades sat huddled together, and every turn of the wheel seemed to carry them further from everything they knew, into an absolute, impenetrable unknown. The fear had not yet left them. It had simply changed its form. The sharp, blade-like terror of battle had turned into the dull, aching pain of expecting the worst. A single thought pounded in their heads. They were being taken to the slaughter, to a camp surrounded by barbed wire, where hunger worked to the point of exhaustion and a slow death awaited them. Finally, after several days of travel, the air filled with the salty iodine smell of the sea. They were unloaded in a huge port, bustling like a disturbed anthill. People hurried everywhere, cranes roared, and ships sounded their horns. And among them, at the pier, it stood, a gigantic Liberty-class transport ship. Its gray hull, streaked with rust, towered over the pier like a sheer cliff. It did not look like a prison ship. It was a floating mountain of steel, silent and indifferent. When the command to board was given, a panicked whisper ran through the ranks of prisoners. This was it, the beginning of the end. They climbed the shaky gangway, carried along by a faceless stream, not daring to look up. Everyone expected to be driven with kicks and rifle butts into a dark, foul-smelling hold, where they would spend the rest of their journey amidst rats and filth. They were ready for it. The propaganda had prepared them for it. Hans stepped from the gangway onto the deck and followed the others down a steep metal staircase. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the stench of filth and decay. But instead, an unexpected, almost forgotten aroma hit his nostrils, the faint smell of carbolic acid, machine oil, and food. He opened his eyes. They were not in a filthy hold. They were in a huge, well-lit compartment where hundreds of neat bunks stretched out in 3 tiers. On each lay a folded gray blanket. The air was clean. The space was divided into sections, and order reigned everywhere. A cold, soulless order, but order nonetheless. It was so unlike what their imaginations had painted that for a moment, Hans felt as if he had died and ended up in some strange, absurd purgatory. Soon, they were lined up and led to the galley. There, in large aluminum vats, something unimaginable was steaming. They were given metal trays, and an American cook, a black giant with a pearly white smile, ladled each of them a portion of thick meat stew with beans, placed 2 slices of dazzlingly white bread and a pat of butter on the side. And at the end of the line, their iron mugs were filled with coffee. Real, aromatic coffee, not the bitter drink made from roasted barley they had grown used to. For the first few days, the prisoners ate in silence, hastily and with distrust, glancing around warily. It had to be a trap, an elaborate, diabolical trap. They were being fattened up like geese before Christmas. But for what? For medical experiments? For some monstrous ritual? They could not believe the simplicity of what was happening. 3 times a day, they were fed hot, high-calorie food. In the mornings, they were even allowed on deck in small groups. Hans, who had grown up among the Bavarian mountains, was seeing the ocean for the first time in his life. Everywhere he looked, an endless, gray-blue, watery desert stretched to the horizon, and their ship seemed like a lonely splinter, lost in eternity. The sight was simultaneously frightening and mesmerizing. It made them physically feel how far they were from home, from the war, from their entire past lives. They were nowhere, in a giant floating bubble moving at the enemy's will toward an unknown destination. The guards, made up of equally bored American boys, showed no aggression. They made sure no one went too close to the rail, chatted lazily, and smoked. It seemed they were completely indifferent to whom they were transporting, prisoners of war or crates of canned goods. This was logistics, not revenge. The days passed. 2 weeks of this surreal journey slowly but surely dismantled the architecture of their fear. The body, receiving enough food and rest, began to overpower the mind, tormented by propaganda. Hans noticed his hands had stopped shaking. The pale, gaunt faces of his comrades began to regain a healthy color. In the evenings, in their quarters, one could hear not only frightened whispers, but also quiet conversations, and sometimes even muffled laughter. They were still prisoners, but the terror had been replaced by a dull, ringing bewilderment. Not one of them could yet believe that this was war. After endless days when the horizon was just a monotonous line dividing the gray sky from the gray water, a dark spot finally appeared on that line. It grew with each hour, taking shape, and soon transformed into the distant panorama of a gigantic, unbelievable city. This was America. Contrary to all expectations, they were not disembarked on a deserted, uninhabited shore. Their ship slowly entered the harbor of Norfolk, Virginia, and what they saw was like a phantasmagoria, a postcard from another, impossible world brought to life. Dozens, hundreds of ships stood at the piers. Skyscrapers, the likes of which Hans had never seen even in Berlin, poked their spires into the clouds. But most importantly, the city was alive. It seethed, it bustled, it breathed with a full chest. Along the waterfronts, streams of colorful cars, like bright beetles, rolled along, gleaming in the sun. People, men in elegant suits, women in bright dresses, hurried about their business, laughing, talking. Not a single destroyed building, not a single bomb crater, not a single blacked-out window. The war, which for them had been the very air they breathed for the last few years, seemed here to be nothing more than a newspaper headline, a topic for dinner conversation. They were unloaded onto the shore. Again, the business-like routine, the commands, the head counts. But now they were walking on solid ground, and each step on that asphalt was a step into another reality. They were put through delousing, another humiliating, yet surprisingly quick and organized procedure. They were issued new clothes, coarse but clean cotton shirts and dark blue pants, with 2 large white letters painted on the back, PW, Prisoner of War. This mark was the only thing connecting them to reality. Everything else felt like a dream. Then they were led to a train station. The train awaiting them shattered all their expectations once again. These were not cattle cars, not freight wagons for livestock that had haunted their nightmares. These were ordinary passenger cars with soft seats and large, clean windows. When the train began to move, everyone gathered at those windows. The train rolled slowly through the suburbs, and what they saw was like an endless Hollywood movie unfolding right before their eyes. Hans pressed his forehead against the cold glass, unable to tear his eyes away. Here was a small town, neat houses with perfectly manicured lawns, each with its own car, sometimes even 2. A woman in an apron was hanging dazzlingly white laundry on a line. Children on bicycles chased a dog. They passed a store whose window was bursting with goods, pyramids of canned goods with bright labels, bunches of bananas. Hans hadn't seen them in 5 years. Mountains of oranges, sausages, cheeses. He looked at this abundance with a kind of sacred terror. In his native Germany, such a collection of products could fetch a fortune on the black market. But here, it was just food, available every day. Gas stations with bright neon signs and movie theaters with posters promising films starring Gary Cooper and Bette Davis flew past the window. A world that lived as if there were no war at all. And in that moment, a wave of not hatred, not envy, but a kind of cosmic, universal alienation washed over Hans. He realized they had not been fighting just another army. They had been fighting another planet. A civilization whose wealth and power were so immense that it could wage the bloodiest war in history with almost no change to its usual way of life. Their sacrifices, their hardships, their faith in victory, all of it seemed pathetic and ridiculous in the face of this showcase of a consumer paradise. The train carried them further and further into the continent. Endless fields of corn, huge farms, and herds of fat cows drifted by. And everywhere there were signs of this calm, confident, incomprehensible abundance. At night, the cities shone with millions of lights, and this glow seemed blasphemous after the blacked-out, fear-stricken cities of Europe. The prisoners barely spoke. They just watched. Each of them was on his own internal journey, a journey from a soldier who believed in the righteousness of his cause to a small, stunned man who understood the full scale of the lie he had been living. They still didn't know where they were being taken, but they already understood that they had lost. They hadn't lost on the battlefield. They had lost to these shining storefronts, these streams of cars, these neat lawns. They had lost long before they ever fired the first shot. The train that had carried them through the heart of America finally slowed to a stop in the middle of a sun-scorched plain that seemed as boundless as the ocean. The camp, which was to be their home for an indefinite period, rose from the heat haze like a mirage. At first glance, it was exactly as their imaginations had painted it. Rows of identical wooden barracks, watchtowers along the perimeter, and several rings of barbed wire glittering in the sun like a wicked web. It was a prison, unquestionably. But even here, the devil, as always, was in the details. The barracks stood on perfectly level ground. Neat gravel paths were laid out between them. There was no sign of mud or trash anywhere. Everything breathed a stern, almost sterile order. They were counted again and assigned to barracks. Inside, instead of the expected bunks and straw mattresses, stood neat rows of metal cots with mattresses. Each man was given 2 blankets and even a pillow. It was unthinkable. It was offensive in its methodical humanity. But the real blow, the one that was meant to shatter their war-ravaged minds, was yet to come. An hour later, a gong sounded, calling them to dinner. The prisoners, huddled together in a sullen crowd, trudged toward the large, low building of the mess hall. They walked in silence, preparing to receive their portion of gruel, their ration of stale bread. They were prepared for anything except what awaited them. Inside the mess hall, there was a hum, but it was not the hum of hungry, angry men. It was the hum of hundreds of utensils clattering against metal trays. The smell that hit Hans's nostrils made him stop at the threshold. It smelled of fried meat, fresh bread, and strong coffee. Swallowing a thick saliva, he moved along in the line, mechanically holding out his tray. What he received seemed like a still life from some pre-war cookbook. 2 sausages floated in a thick tomato sauce with beans, a mountain of mashed potatoes, on top of which a golden square of butter was slowly melting. 2 slices of white bread, as airy and porous as a cloud, accompanied by a small jar of orange jam. And at the end of the line, a mug of steaming coffee, into which you could put 2 lumps of sugar. 2 lumps of sugar. Hans sat down at a long wooden table, staring at his tray as if it were something from another planet. His hands trembled slightly. He picked up his fork and speared a piece of sausage. The taste was real. Not a soy substitute, not a sham, but real, juicy, fatty meat. He broke off a piece of bread, spread it with butter, then jam, and took a bite. The sweetness, mixed with the salty taste of the butter, exploded in his mouth in a fireworks display of forgotten sensations. And in that very moment, instead of joy or relief, a wave of sharp, almost physical shame washed over him. He suddenly remembered the last letter from home, from his mother, written on gray, poor-quality paper. She wrote that they were lucky. They had managed to get some potato peels on their ration cards, which made an almost festive soup from potato peels. And here he was, a prisoner of the enemy, eating white bread with jam. Not joy, but a heavy, suffocating feeling of guilt descended upon him. He felt like a traitor to his starving family, to his starving country. He looked around and saw that he was not alone in his feelings. A young man across from him, a boy of about 17, was eating and crying silently, his tears falling directly into his mashed potatoes. The prisoner's ration in an American camp, as they later learned, was regulated not by the commandant's whim, but by the strict rules of the Geneva Convention. Its caloric content was over 3,000 calories a day, more than an American soldier serving on a base in the States received. By comparison, the ration for an ordinary worker in Germany by the end of the war barely reached 1,500 calories. The Americans were simply fulfilling their obligations, with the only difference being that their country could afford it without breaking a sweat. That evening, lying on his cot in the barrack, Hans felt full for the first time in years. His body, exhausted by hunger and cold, was in bliss, but his soul was in turmoil. In the barrack, the day's miracle was discussed in whispers. Some claimed it was a slow-acting poison, others that they were being fattened up for sale into slavery on plantations where strong workers were needed. No one could accept the simplest and most terrifying truth. For the Americans, this was just food, a standard ration, the norm. This banality of abundance was more frightening than any cruelty. It devalued their entire struggle, all their sacrifices. It was the most sophisticated torture imaginable, torture by satiety. The first weeks in the camp passed in a haze of well-fed numbness. The body, receiving calories it hadn't seen in years, slowly recovered. The dark circles under their eyes disappeared, their cheeks filled out, and their movements became more confident. But once the initial, animalistic hunger was satisfied, another, far more terrible torture took its place: the thick molasses of idleness. Each day was like the last. Wake up, breakfast, roll call. Then, the long, endless hours that had to be killed somehow. The prisoners wandered the campgrounds like shadows, trapped in a sunny but airless space. They mended their clothes, played cards, the work was hard, but it was straightforward. They picked tomatoes, weeded corn, and loaded hay. The farmer showed them what to do, more with gestures than words, and worked alongside them. At noon, his wife brought them huge ham sandwiches and a pitcher of ice-cold lemonade. In the evening, as the sun began to set, they were taken back to the camp, and at the end of the week, the most incredible thing happened. They were lined up again, and an officer with a stack of papers in his hand began to call them out one by one. When his name was called, Hans stepped forward, and the American handed him several small paper coupons. On them was written, 10 cents, $1. It was his pay, 80 cents for each workday. He stood there, holding the crisp papers, unable to believe his eyes. This was not just a reward, it was a symbol that his labor, the labor of a prisoner, an enemy, had value, that he was not a slave, he was a paid worker. In that moment, the steel skeleton of propaganda that still held up in his mind cracked and crumbled to dust. The next day, he went to the camp store, which they called the canteen. It was another America in miniature. On the shelves were cartons of Lucky Strike and Camel cigarettes, pyramids of Coca-Cola bottles, bars of chocolate, tins of tooth powder, razor blades, soap, and magazines with bright covers. Hans stood at the counter for a long time, hesitating. Then he handed the clerk, another prisoner, one of his coupons, and pointing his finger, uttered one of the few English words he knew: Coca-Cola. He walked out of the store holding a sweating glass bottle. Prying the cap off on a special opener on the wall, he took his first sip. The cold, sweet, prickly liquid burned his throat. This taste was the taste of freedom. Illusory, confined by barbed wire, but no less stunning for it. He stood under a foreign sky, thousands of kilometers from his ruined home, drinking the enemy's beverage, bought with money earned from the enemy, and for the first time in a long time, he felt not like number PW 345, but like a person who had a choice, at least the choice of what to spend his 80 cents on. If work became a salvation from idleness and food became fuel for the body, then the leisure that blossomed behind the barbed wire of the American camps became food for the soul. The administration, following the same pragmatic logic, a busy prisoner is a safe prisoner, not only did not hinder, but actively encouraged all forms of cultural and sports activities. What grew from this soil surpassed all imaginable expectations and turned the camps into the strangest and most vibrant German cities on the planet. It all started with football. A passion that neither war nor captivity could extinguish erupted with incredible force. As soon as it appeared, the first homemade ball, sewn from old rags and stuffed with whatever they could find, became the center of the universe. In a huge vacant lot in the middle of the camp, the prisoners cleared a field and built goals from dug-in posts. Barracks turned into teams, and soon the passions of a football league were in full swing. Cries of "Tor," "Goal" echoed throughout the area, and the American guards in the watchtowers watched with lazy curiosity these fierce battles where former soldiers of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine fought for the title of camp champion. It was a war in miniature, but a war without blood or hatred, a war that healed rather than maimed. But the German spirit demanded more than just bread and circuses. It demanded music and words. It soon turned out that among the tens of thousands of prisoners were professional musicians, actors, artists, and professors, and they longed to do what they did best. In Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a group of former musicians from the Berlin Philharmonic managed to obtain used instruments through the Red Cross. A few months later, the sounds of Mozart and Beethoven poured from the windows of one of the barracks in the evenings. The Camp Symphony Orchestra, composed of enemy soldiers, gave concerts for thousands of other enemy soldiers, and this music, playing in the middle of the American heartland, was a bridge thrown across an ocean of hatred to the shores of their shared, lost European culture. Hans, who had never seen live theater in his Bavarian village, went to the announcement of a premiere with disbelief. In the largest barrack, converted into an auditorium, they were staging Goethe's Faust. The stage was cobbled together from crates, the costumes sewn from old blankets and burlap. The scenery was drawn with charcoal on large sheets of cardboard. The role of Margarita, for lack of women, was played by a delicate, fair-haired youth, a former radio operator. When the curtain, made of two sewn-together sheets, parted, and the actor playing Faust, a professor of literature at Heidelberg University before the war, delivered his first monologue on the futility of knowledge, a dead silence fell upon the hall. Hans did not understand all the subtleties of high poetry, but he felt something else. He saw how, on this humble stage, these men, his fellow sufferers, were creating an entire world out of nothing, by the power of words and imagination alone. And in this desperate, almost insane attempt to preserve human dignity amidst humiliation and captivity, there was something incredibly moving and powerful. He looked at the actors, at their inspired faces that had forgotten they were prisoners, and suddenly understood. You can take away a man's freedom, his homeland, his weapon, but you cannot take away his inner world, his culture, if he himself does not want to give it up. This theater was their last bastion, their true west wall, which no enemy could breach. The educational program was another miracle of this upside-down world. In many camps, real universities behind barbed wire opened. Prisoner professors gave lectures on history, philosophy, mathematics, and agronomy. Thousands of young men whose education had been interrupted by the war got a chance to catch up. They sat on benches made of planks and eagerly absorbed knowledge, taking notes on any paper they could find. The Americans not only allowed this, they supplied textbooks and stationery through the Red Cross. They understood that a man studying English or the basics of crop rotation was far less dangerous than one who spent his days plotting revenge. Thus, in the midst of the American prairies and forests, a unique society emerged. A society that lived by its own laws, spoke its own language, and created its own art. It was full of life, talent, and energy, and all of this was behind barbed wire. This cultural life was the most powerful antidote to the poison of propaganda. After all, a world where prisoners of war could stage Faust and listen to symphonies was nothing like the hell they had been warned about. It was strange, incomprehensible, but it was humane. The American command, with its pragmatism bordering on cynicism, understood perfectly well that feeding and employing hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers was only half the battle. That was a tactic to solve the problem here and now. But strategy required looking beyond the horizon of the war. How could they prevent the emergence of a new Hitler in 20 years? How could they ensure that these young, healthy, energetic men, upon returning home, would not become the core of a revanchist movement? The answer was obvious. They had to win the second, invisible war, the war for their minds. Thus was born one of the most large-scale and subtle programs of psychological influence in history. It had nothing in common with the crude, frontal propaganda the Germans were used to. The Americans were not going to force them to march under the Star-Spangled Banner or sing the Star-Spangled Banner. Their strategy was far more sophisticated. It was like the work of a skilled surgeon who does not break bones but carefully, layer by layer, removes the malignant tumor of Nazi ideology that had grown into the brain of an entire generation. The first tool in this arsenal was a newspaper. A German-language newspaper called Der Ruf, the Call, was created specifically for the prisoners. At first, it was met with contempt. The prisoners were sure it was just another leaflet filled with primitive lies. But the publishers were smarter. The first issues contained only objective reports from the fronts, including news of Allied setbacks, sports scores, and domestic announcements from other camps. The newspaper slowly gained trust, and then, once the reader was hooked, they began to inject the poison, or rather, the antidote. Articles appeared about how Hitler actually came to power, reprints from books banned in Germany, interviews with German anti-fascist intellectuals. It was like a slow, gradual increase in the dose of a medicine. But the real bombshell, the explosion of which was meant to destroy the last remnants of faith, was yet to come. One evening, their company was assembled in the barrack-turned-movie theater. Everyone expected another Hollywood comedy or Western. But instead of cheerful music, black and white footage that made the blood run cold appeared on the screen to the crackle of the projector. It was Buchenwald, a liberated Buchenwald. The camera slowly panned across mountains of emaciated, naked bodies, piled up like firewood. It showed the faces of the survivors, living skeletons with huge, empty eyes in which an inhuman horror was frozen. It showed the crematorium ovens, still warm, lampshades made of human skin, piles of children's shoes. The hall was in absolute dead silence, broken only by the hum of the projector. Hans sat clutching the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't breathe. This couldn't be happening. It was a montage, a monstrous, diabolical fake by the enemy. Wehrmacht soldiers could not have been involved in this. They were soldiers, not executioners. But the camera dispassionately showed more and more evidence, and at some point, the icy wall of denial that his brain had built for self-protection collapsed. He remembered the rumors that had circulated on the Eastern Front about some special SS squads, rumors they had brushed away like annoying flies. He remembered his contempt for party functionaries, but he never could have imagined such a scale. He felt nausea rising in his throat. Someone next to him threw up. When the lights came on in the hall, the prisoners sat staring into space. No one uttered a word. It was the end of their world. That night in the barracks, there were no arguments, no conversations. There was only the heavy, suffocating silence of thousands of men who had suddenly realized what kind of regime they had been shedding their blood for. After this session of film therapy, the other tools of re-education went to work with double the force. The camp libraries were filled with thousands of volumes by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Stefan Zweig, all those whose books had burned on pyres in Germany 12 years earlier. Reading them was like breathing fresh air after a stuffy basement. Hollywood films, even the most light-hearted ones, served the same purpose. They showed a world where individuality was valued, where social mobility was possible, where an ordinary person could challenge the system and win. It was a world completely opposite to the totalitarian, militaristic barracks of the Third Reich. Of course, this process was not smooth. The convinced Nazis, whom the Americans had prudently screened and kept in separate black camps, resisted to the last. They called the newspapers Jewish poison and the films about concentration camps a Hollywood production. But for the vast majority, for the gray, ordinary men like Hans, these seeds of doubt fell on fertile ground. The Americans were not making them into Democrats. They were merely giving them the information and the tools so that they themselves, through agony and doubt, would come to the conclusion that for 12 years they had been led down a false path. It was their most powerful and most humane weapon. The American administration, in creating conditions for the prisoners that shattered their worldview, overlooked one key factor: a power vacuum. By removing their officers and non-commissioned officers, they handed over the internal administration of the camp to the prisoners themselves. And in this vacuum, like in a petri dish, the very infection they were trying to cure immediately began to multiply. Behind the facade of football matches, theater productions, and university lectures, another invisible and merciless war was being waged. A war for souls. The main force in this underground struggle were Die Harten, the hard ones. These were fanatics, convinced National Socialists to the core, for whom Germany's defeat was merely a temporary setback, and surrender a shameful but reversible transgression. They were in the minority, but this minority was cohesive, aggressive, and ruthless. They quickly established an underground hierarchy that mirrored the structure of the NSDAP. Each barrack had its own block leader, who monitored morale, reported upstairs, and administered justice. Their main enemy became Die Weichen, the soft ones, those who, in their opinion, had succumbed to enemy propaganda, who had broken. Those who started learning English, read Der Ruf with interest, or, the most terrible sin of all, openly doubted the Führer's genius and the final victory. These men were called Verräter, traitors, by the hard ones. And for traitors, the conversation was short. At first, it was psychological pressure. The traitor was ostracized. People stopped talking to him. His place at the mess hall table was always empty, and he was pushed in the lines. A drawn gallows or insulting graffiti might appear on his cot. It was a war of nerves, designed to break the apostate's will, to force him back into silence, to rejoin the correct majority. But when that didn't work, fists came into play. At night, when the lights went out and the American guards dozed peacefully in their watchtowers, a blanket court might be held in the barrack. A blanket would be thrown over the traitor so he couldn't see faces or scream, and he would be brutally kicked and beaten with clubs. In the morning, the unfortunate man would explain his bruises and broken ribs by saying he fell off his cot. Everyone understood, but they remained silent. Fear was stronger than the desire for justice. Hans came face to face with this secret war. In his barrack lived an elderly Austrian named Franz, a former music teacher, a quiet and intelligent man. Franz was one of the first to sign up for English classes and enthusiastically read the forbidden books from the camp library. He didn't argue, he didn't proselytize. He simply lived in his own world of books and musical memories. But for the hard ones, his silent dissent was like a red flag to a bull. One evening, Hans came upon 3 burly former paratroopers who had cornered Franz in the washroom. Their leader, a broad-shouldered NCO with icy eyes named Kurt, held Franz by the collar of his shirt. "We heard you've been telling the newcomers that the films about the camps are true, you old bastard," he hissed. "Do you want us to remind you what's done to traitors of the Reich?" Franz's face was as white as a sheet, but his eyes held no fear, only a weary disgust. "The Reich is dead, Kurt," he said quietly. "You just don't want to admit it, because then you'd have to admit you gave your lives for a lie." The punch to his face was so powerful that Franz flew back against the wall and slid to the floor, leaving a bloody trail on the tiles. Hans froze. A part of him screamed to intervene, to help. But another, animal part, bound by a sticky fear, ordered him to stay silent. He saw Kurt's eyes, and in them was the same cold, ruthless emptiness he had seen on the battlefield. He realized the front line had not disappeared. It had simply moved here, to this sun-drenched camp, and the line of fire now ran not between trenches, but between cots in the same barrack. In some camps, this secret war reached extremes. Dozens of cases of brutal beatings and at least 5 proven murders committed by these courts of honor were recorded. The American administration, which had initially turned a blind eye, was eventually forced to intervene. Investigations began, and the most odious Nazis were isolated in special high-security camps. But it was impossible to completely eradicate this cancerous tumor. This war in the barracks was the last desperate convulsion of a dying ideology. The fanatics, sensing that the world they believed in was collapsing, tried to hold it together by force, intimidating and maiming those who had already taken a step into a new reality. And for many prisoners, it was precisely this cruelty from their own countrymen that became the final straw, definitively turning them away from the ideas of National Socialism. They saw its true face, not at the Nuremberg rallies, but here, in the dark corners of the prisoner of war barracks. Good food, paid work, symphony orchestras, and even the chance to learn English. All of this was true. But there was another truth, invisible, but no less real. A truth not written about in the Der Ruf newspaper or shown in Hollywood movies. The truth that a golden cage, no matter how comfortable, is still a cage. The psychological pressure of captivity accumulated slowly, like water, drop by drop, wearing away a stone. At first, it was almost unnoticeable, buried under new, overwhelming impressions and physical recovery. But months passed, then a year, and the novelty wore off. In its place came a dull, exhausting anguish that the prisoners called Stacheldrahtkrankheit, barbed wire sickness. Its symptoms were apathy, irritability, and a sharp, almost physical sensation of confinement. Hans began to catch himself unconsciously pacing the perimeter of the barrack, like an animal in a cage, measuring the boundaries of his freedom with his steps. Every glance at the watchtowers, at the glistening threads of barbed wire that separated him from the vast American expanses, was like the prick of a red-hot needle. Freedom was so close, just over that hill, beyond that grove, and at the same time, completely unattainable. It was maddening. But the worst part was the not knowing. Letters from home took months to arrive, passing through double censorship, German and American. Sometimes they never came at all. Every piece of news was like a breath of fresh air, but each one could also bring terrible news. Hans received a letter from his sister only 8 months after his capture. She wrote that their house in Munich had been destroyed in a bombing raid. His parents were alive, huddling with relatives in a village, but his father was seriously ill. Every line of the letter was steeped in hunger, cold, and despair. That night, Hans did not sleep. He lay on his cot, staring at the dark window, beyond which shone the unfamiliar cold stars of a foreign continent. And suddenly, he was overwhelmed by a wave of such sharp, piercing despair that he almost suffocated. Here he was, a healthy 20-year-old man, warm, well-fed, and safe. And there, thousands of kilometers away, his sick parents were starving in the ruins. His sister was probably selling their last belongings to buy a little food, and he could do nothing. He couldn't help in any way. He was a helpless, useless observer. His satiety and safety at that moment seemed not a blessing, but a curse. He was ready to trade all his portions of white bread with jam, all the dollars he had earned in captivity, for a single opportunity to be there, next to them, to share their suffering, to hug his mother, to simply be useful. The survivor's guilt that had been smoldering in him since the first day of his captivity flared up with a new, unbearable force. He realized that the Americans, without wanting to, had invented the most sophisticated torture. They did not torture the body, they slowly crucified the soul. This barbed wire sickness manifested in different ways. Some withdrew into themselves, staring silently at a single point for hours. Others, on the contrary, became aggressive, starting fights over the slightest provocation. Some tried to escape. These escapes were acts of pure desperation, almost suicide. Where could a German prisoner who didn't know the language run in the heart of a hostile continent? Most were caught within a few days, hungry and exhausted, in the nearest forest. But they tried again and again, because the illusion of action was better than paralyzing helplessness. Sometimes the tension would break in the most unexpected ways. The camp saw an increase in nervous breakdowns. During a football match, a player might suddenly fall to the ground and start sobbing. During an orchestra rehearsal, a violinist might scream and smash his instrument. These were not fits of madness. They were the cries of a soul locked in a cage of satiety and hopelessness. The prisoners tried to fight it as best they could. Work, sports, theater, all of it was not just leisure, but a form of psychotherapy. By creating something, by building a model ship, learning a role, or solving a math problem, they were building a small inner world where the barbed wire could not penetrate. They were creating order in their souls to counter the chaos and uncertainty of the outside world. But the barbed wire sickness was incurable. The only medicine for it was freedom, and the prisoners waited for it like manna from heaven. They waited for the day the war would end, and this strange, agonizing dream would finally be over. They did not yet know that the awakening would be even more shocking than the dream itself. Victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945, was met with a strange, deafening silence in the prisoner of war camps. There were no joyful shouts, no tears of relief. There was only a frozen, tense pause. The war was over. The Reich, to which they had sworn allegiance and given their youth, had ceased to exist. This meant they would soon be going home. But this thought brought not only joy, but also a dull, underlying anxiety. What awaited them there, in that ruined, humiliated country, divided into occupation zones that they still called home? The repatriation process was long and arduous. Months passed before the first ships carrying former prisoners departed from American shores. The journey back across the Atlantic was the complete opposite of the first. Then, they had sailed into the unknown, full of fear. Now, they were sailing toward their past, full of a vague hope and an even vaguer dread. They were different. In their 2 or 3 years in America, they had changed both externally and internally. They came ashore in the ports of Le Havre or Antwerp, not as emaciated skeletons, but as sturdy, well-dressed men. Many carried plywood suitcases packed with American cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, and nylon stockings, priceless treasures in post-war Europe. They were dressed in American military uniforms, from which the insignia had been removed. They looked almost like victors, but this was only a facade. The first shock hit them right at the port. Europe greeted them with ruins, not just a few destroyed buildings as they had imagined, but entire cities, wiped from the face of the earth. The skeletons of houses, like rotten teeth, stuck out against the gray sky. Thin, gray people in rags wandered the streets, which were littered with broken bricks. Their faces were impenetrable masks of exhaustion and apathy. Looking at them, Hans and his comrades felt for the first time like strangers, like aliens who had landed on a dead planet. Hans's journey home to Munich took almost 2 weeks. He traveled in overcrowded freight cars, on the roofs of trains, and on foot. And the deeper he went into the heart of Germany, the more terrifying the picture became. It was a land of ghosts. He reached the address his sister had given him. It was a wooden barrack on the outskirts of the city, where 3 families were crammed together. He knocked. The door was opened by an emaciated, gray-haired woman in a worn-out dress. He did not immediately recognize his own mother, and she did not recognize him. She looked at this tall, rosy-cheeked young man in a sturdy American jacket with mistrust and fear. "Hans?" she finally whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Is that really you, son?" He stepped inside and hugged her fragile, bony shoulders. The room smelled of dampness and poverty. His father lay on the bed, thin beyond recognition. His sister sat beside him, her young face looking like parchment. They stared at him, at his clean-shaven face, his clean clothes, his suitcase, as if he were an alien. He opened the suitcase and began to lay his treasures on the table: cans of stewed meat, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes. He thought they would be happy, but in their eyes, he saw not joy, but something else, a complex mixture of amazement, envy, and alienation. That evening, over a meager dinner, he tried to tell them about his life in America, about the white bread, the farm work, the theater. He spoke, and they were silent. And in that silence, he suddenly felt an invisible glass wall rise up between him and his family. They had survived the hell of bombings, hunger, and fear. And he had been in a golden cage. He could not share their pain, and they could not understand his experience. To them, his stories of a well-fed captivity sounded like a mockery, like boasting. His sister was the first to break. "It was easy for you over there, in your America," she said with a bitter smirk, "while we were dying of hunger here." Her words hit him like a slap in the face. He wanted to shout that he had suffered too, that he had been dying of homesickness and guilt, that the barbed wire sickness was no easier than hunger. But he said nothing. He understood that they would never understand. The chasm between their experiences was too deep. That night, for the first time in 2 years, he felt truly alone. Not in an American camp among thousands like him, but here, in his own family, among his closest relatives. This experience was universal for hundreds of thousands of returning prisoners. Their stories of a sweet captivity were met with disbelief, ridicule, and a sullen hostility. Neighbors whispered behind their backs, fattened up on American grub, the traitors. They were called Ami-Freund, buddy of the Americans. They had returned home, but home did not accept them. They were strangers among their own people, and this final, most cruel blow of fate made them finally understand. The old world was no more, and they would have to build a new one. The history of the 20th century is written in blood and iron, but sometimes its most important chapters are written with invisible ink on the pages of human souls. The experience of nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war in America became one of these chapters, quiet, ambiguous, and having a huge, though not immediately noticeable, influence on the future of an entire continent. These men, who returned to the ruins of the Third Reich, were not just defeated soldiers. They were graduates of the strangest and most large-scale school of democracy in history. A school where the lessons were a hearty meal, paid labor, and a Hollywood movie. They returned carrying within them the virus of another world, a world where what is valued is not collective will, but personal success, where human rights are not an empty phrase, but the foundation of the law, and where a consumer society defeated a totalitarian ideology. At first, this legacy seemed like a curse. The alienation they met at home was painful. They were bearers of an uncomfortable truth, living witnesses to the fact that the enemy was not the monster propaganda had painted. Their experience devalued the suffering of those who had remained. But as Germany slowly rose from the ashes, this curse began to turn into a blessing. It was these men, the Ami-Freunde, who became one of the most important human resources for building the new West Germany. Unlike the older generation, poisoned by imperial ambitions, and unlike those who had fought on the Eastern Front and returned from Soviet camps with a hatred for communism but no love for democracy, the Americans had real, positive experience interacting with the Western world. They did not love America with a blind love, but they understood it. They saw its strengths and weaknesses, its pragmatism, its power, and its naive faith in progress. They played their quiet but important role in the Wirtschaftswunder, The German economic miracle. Thousands of former prisoners who had studied the basics of agricultural mechanization in the camps became innovative farmers. Those who had learned English found work in the administrations of the occupying authorities and later in the offices of international companies. They were a bridge between two worlds. They became the quiet architects of a new transatlantic Germany, firmly embedded in the Western Alliance. But the main legacy was not economic, but mental. These hundreds of thousands of men who had seen with their own eyes the total lie of Nazi propaganda became a living vaccine against revanchism. When neo-Nazi groups began to rear their heads in the 50s, it was the voices of former soldiers who had been through the American camps that sounded particularly weighty. They could say, "Boys, I was there. I saw it all with my own eyes. They are lying to you again." Hans lived a long life. He rebuilt his home and raised children. He rarely spoke of the war and almost never of his captivity. Only sometimes, when his grandchildren, already in the 70s, asked him about the war, he would take a small, faded cardboard label from a Coca-Cola bottle out of an old box. He would look at it, and in his eyes would appear that same childlike bewilderment he had felt back in '44. He and millions like him went to war, ready to die for the Führer and Great Germany. They were prepared for bullets, bayonets, and shells. But no one prepared them for the fact that the enemy's main weapon would turn out to be not hatred, but pragmatic humanity. That the most powerful shell to destroy their world would not be a high explosive bomb, but a piece of white bread with butter. The American re-education program was not an act of altruism. It was a cold, strategic calculation. But that calculation, as often happens in history, yielded completely unexpected fruits, turning yesterday's enemies into the most loyal allies and proving that sometimes the path to lasting peace lies not through revenge, but through a full stomach and an open book. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.